Welcome, everyone. This is the public meeting portion of the Water Science and Technology Board of the National Academy of Sciences. Today, our public meeting will be focusing on pressing issues at the interface of water science and environmental justice. Before we get started, I want to let you know that we will have an opportunity for each of you to ask questions. So using the chat, you can offer questions, which there will be some time for at the end. There should be a slide up with that information. If you have any issues or problems with the Zoom connection or link, please feel free to contact Eric Edkin. You can see his address below. To kick things off, let me again welcome you all to this public portion of the meeting of the Water Science and Technology Board. To give you a little more context, I want to introduce briefly all of the members of the board. My name is Kathy Kling. I'm a professor at the Dyson School at Cornell. Next, Nusha.
Hi, I'm Nusha Jami. I direct the Urban Water Policy Program at Stanford's Woods Institute.
Thank you. Jonathan Arthur.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Arthur. I'm the State Geologist of Florida and Director of the Florida Geological Survey, which is a division within the Florida Department of Environmental Protection.
Thanks. Ruth?
Hi, I'm Ruth Berkelman, and I'm a Professor Emeritus at Emory University.
Thank you. Wendy?
Hi, I'm Wendy Graham. I'm a hydrologist, professor, and director of the Water Institute at the University of Florida.
Bob Hirsch.
I'm Bob Hirsch, research hydrologist emeritus, U.S. Geological Survey.
Thank you. Venkat.
Hi, I'm Venkataraman Lakshmi. I'm a professor of engineering systems and environment at the University of Virginia.
Mark.
I'm Mark Lashavaya. I'm retired from American Water, where I was the chief environmental scientist.
Margaret.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Margaret Palmer. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland and director of the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center.
Thank you. David Sedlak.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Sedlak. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UC Berkeley and director of the Berkeley Water Center.
And I missed Dave Wegner.
Dave Wegner, Tucson, Arizona, retired congressional water staffer who can't seem to escape, and part-time Woolpert Engineering.
And now Kay Whitlock.
Yes, hi, Kay Whitlock, water resources engineer, currently a consultant to local governments, primarily in the Chicago region.
Great, thank you all. Again, welcome, if you're just joining us, to the public portion of the meeting of the Water Science and Technology Board. Today, we will be exploring pressing issues at the interface of water science and environmental justice. I'd like to start by noting that in addition to speaking for myself at this moment, I believe I speak for many at the academies as well as millions of Americans when I say that the brutality and racial injustices that have been so visibly, pointedly, and repeatedly demonstrated over this past year have been a sad awakening and frankly has shaken some of my core beliefs about society. The brutal killings of Black Americans, the hugely disproportionate toll of illness and death suffered by minority and low-income populations due to the coronavirus, and stories of racist interruptions against Americans seeking simply to enjoy a day birdwatching in a public park emphasize the pervasiveness of these issues. Like many Americans, members of the Water Science and Technology Board have asked ourselves whether we need to look harder at our own lives and especially at our own institutions to identify and address our own shortcomings. For the Water Science and Technology Board, a board of the National Academy of Sciences that focuses on the critical natural resource, water, It didn't take long for us to realize we should ask ourselves what we were and possibly more importantly, we're not doing in the arena of environmental justice and water. Further, we pretty quickly realized we could not begin a serious conversation about this topic without reaching out to learn from others. After all, how could we begin to consider how the board might leverage the science strengths and convening power of the national academies until we were more aware of the issues? To do so, we have two goals for today's webinar. First, we want to start the process of listening and learning from others who have years of experience addressing and working closely with environmental justice issues related to water. And second, we want to invite them and you to provide suggestions about how the board and the national academies might provide social value in this critical space. So that brings me to the webinar today. I am thrilled that we have gathered an incredible group of experts. We begin with 5 who bring in-depth experience and knowledge on a range of environmental justice issues to begin our discussion. We've asked these individuals to provide brief overviews of a specific environmental justice issue or a case study to help us contextualize the issues. Now, in so doing, we fully recognize that their work and topics are just a sampling of the water-related environmental justice issues facing our country. So, to augment their presentations, we have 3 additional expert panelists who will share their views on the most important environmental justice issues in the water arena. And then, to help us segue to a discussion that begins to focus on possible roles for the national academies and the Water Science Technology Board specifically, we hope to have a free-flowing conversation with our panelists, all speakers, and followed by some time for questions from the audience. So, particularly if you're new to the national academies, you may be wondering, what are these resources I'm talking about? Let me briefly note that the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine was established in 1863 under the auspices of President Lincoln. The purpose of this organization was to play the role of advisors to the nation by providing objective, evidence-based advice when requested. There's 2 main ways the Academy does this. 1, by bringing together experts to produce independent, objective reports that present evidence-based reports on requested topics. Additionally, we do this through our convening activities, just like this one, where we advance the conversation about critical water issues in our community. So, with no further ado, I want to jump into introducing our first speaker. We are very pleased to welcome Stephen Gasteyer. Stephen is an associate professor of sociology at Michigan State. His research focuses on the nexus between water, land, and community development. Areas of real interest include community capacity development, civic engagement, the political and social processes that enable or hinder community access to water and land, and class and race effects of access to basic services. Thank you, Stephen, and welcome.
Thank you so much. If you'd be kind enough to bring up my first slide. Yeah, thank you. Really, thank you so much. I'm honored to be part of this panel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the other presenters and taking part in a conversation about these really, really important issues. Since the early 21st century, I've been trying to better document and understand the hidden environmental justice crisis of access. Most people in the United States think nothing of stumbling out of bed, opening the tap, filling the coffee maker, using the toilet, showering inside as part of a morning routine. But for a disturbing number of people in the United States in the 2nd decade of the 21st century, access to basic water and sanitation is not so straightforward. Today, what I plan to do is touch on the highlights of a study that I conducted with the staff of 2 non-governmental organizations, the U.S. Water Alliance, whose director we'll hear from later today, and Dig Deep, which is an organization that's been really on the front lines of getting water services to Navajo Nation residents, among other work. We all on the team had experience working with communities and households for whom access to water was a challenge. Building on earlier work, such as the Rural Community Assistance Partnership's 2004 report, Still Living Without the Basics, we wanted to quantify how many lacked access to water and sanitation facilities. Where were those people, who they were, and why were they without services even now? Slide 2, please. We use the only comprehensive data set that exists in the United States that measures who has access to indoor plumbing as a proxy for a basic water and sanitation. The US Census, and more specifically the American Community Survey, conducts a rolling survey of approximately 3.5 million US households that includes questions about whether households have hot and cold water, a bath or shower, and an indoor toilet. These are indexed into complete plumbing facilities as a variable. We sampled down to the census tract, as tracts were still reliable in rural areas, but they are sub-county places, and this is important in the Western United States, where we have very large counties. We used 2010 to 2014 rolling averages so that we could look at changes across time, because under instructions from Congress, Census actually changed that question, or the questions that make up that index. While statistically small, you can see on this slide that the numbers are actually quite concerning. 470,000, approximately 470,000 households lack access to complete plumbing facilities, an estimated 1.4 million people. This can be added to an estimated 250,000 who live without access to water and sanitation in Puerto Rico, and 553,000 who are homeless and therefore lack access to these services. And as a result, we end up with 2 million souls in the United States without these most basic of services. Slide 3. To determine the location of the households, and the extent to which we could establish these were not just people living off the grid, we conducted spatial analysis. Note the pattern on the map. There are distinct spatial clusters of those lacking access. Those clusters are largest in places like the Four Corners region and the Navajo Nation, and southern South Dakota, the Pine Ridge Reservation, but also along the Texas borderlands, and then also in smaller clusters pocked across the United States. I will briefly touch on this later, but my colleagues will talk about more in-depth details of these cases. We then wanted to understand what were the attributes of the places lacking access to plumbing. So we used multivariate analysis, OLS, of the demographic variables in the census to try to understand which social attributes were correlated with communities lacking access. Clearly, lack of access to, and this is to the next slide, please. So clearly, household income and poverty and relatedly unemployment are related to lacking access to plumbing. But it is also about race. Places with higher proportions of African Americans and American Indians and Alaska Natives at the national level were significantly correlated with access to complete plumbing. The next slide, please. Slide 5. We then wanted to understand more specifically, were we looking at ecological fallacies? So we used analysis of the integrated public use microdata sets, IPUMs, to look at the household attributes associated with access to plumbing. Poverty remained significant, but so too did race. And as this slide states, American Indian households were 19 times more likely than white households to lack access to plumbing. African American and Latinx households were twice as likely. Next slide, please. Our study also involved in-depth field research to understand how and why communities had percentages of houses lacking access to water and sanitation. We don't have enough time to go into the details here, but notable that we did find patterns across communities of places that have been bypassed by earlier eras of community water development, such as the Central Valley of California, exposed to colonial relationships, systematically not only denying water rights, but implementing extractive industries such as coal and uranium mining, such as has happened on the Navajo Nation, exposing those people to water laced with toxins. We find regulatory and granting bureaucracies, such as those in Alabama and Texas, embedded in legacy structures that have failed to create systems to fix persistent problems with lack of access to water and sanitation. Slide 7, please. It is notable that as jarring as our findings are, it is almost surely an undercount. It is, for instance, likely that the 2 million recorded in this study does not include households such as those where plumbing is functionally inadequate. We don't really have any way of counting, for instance, how many people are persistently without water and sanitation due to inability to pay water rates and therefore having their water shut off. We do know from existing statistics that millions are served by drinking water systems with health violations, drinking from wells that have been contaminated, or living with deeply inadequate sewage systems. Slide 8, please. So we need to focus on what we can do to address this issue. We could start by recognizing that lack of access to water and sanitation is a crisis, likely related as a social determinant of health vulnerability, as we saw on the Navajo Nation, and I think are seeing on the border. The solutions must involve interdisciplinary work on developing better data to track the issue, participatory governance, financing, and new technological approaches, among other initiatives, but I don't have time to go into depth here. Last slide, please. So thank you so much for listening. I will look forward to discussion as we move on. And even if we don't get to talk during this session, I would love to engage with any of you later, and you can see my information there. Thanks so much.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Stephen. And just a reminder, feel free to start posting questions in the chat room. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, which is Yolanda McDonald. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Human and Organizational Development at Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on the utilization of geospatial approaches to investigate human health outcomes, working on topics such as human health and water injustice associated with lack of access to public water systems and the economic impact of disease associated with climate change. Thank you. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Today, I would like to share insights that I gained from residents who live without a public water supply. The mobile home that you see here is an example of a household that does not have a public water supply, nor do the residents have room to store their water. Next slide, please. The mobile home is located in El Paso County in a colonia. So you may ask, what are colonias? There's approximately 2,000 colonias located along the US-Mexico border. And as Stephen shared with us, these communities tend to have high poverty rates. In addition to that, a lack of access to adequate health care. Not all colonias are the same. They're categorized into 3 groups, one being red, one being yellow, and the other being green. And this is based upon the level of infrastructure and health risk. So in terms of infrastructure, public water and sanitation are examples of that. Today, I will be focusing on red communities that do not have a public water supply or public sanitation. And I have contract for deed noted here because this is important. This is a predatory lending practice that results in people making the decision to live in these communities don't have public services because they're told they're going to have them. So they get into a situation whereby rather than a traditional mortgage, they are paying for the land, but they actually aren't amassing equity every single month. What they're doing is they're paying a debt down, and they don't own that land until their final payment. So this is an example of someone who moved here, put up a trailer, and then added alongside a single family home, which they're building out. So if they move, they will lose everything that they've invested in. Next slide, please. So what does this result in? Well, this environmental justice is also equal to an economic injustice. And the reason being is when you don't have a public water supply, households will pay more for water. They also use less water. So if you can imagine from one moment what it would be like to use 314% fewer gallons per month than someone else in a community that like yours. Shorter showers. That may not seem like a lot, but that may be something that we all take for granted. Or we may decide that we're not going to wash our hands as long as we think we should. Or we may wash vegetables not as long as we should, and so forth. The list goes on and on and on. In addition to that, there's the time that is spent waiting for the water truck to come deliver water to your household, which can be up to 2 times per month. And the window delivery can be up to as long as 8 hours. So you may have to miss work, someone in the household, to have water delivered to you. In addition to that, you may own a truck and go pick up water and haul it. The cost involved with the truck, maintaining it, or even renting it. Or you may have to go to one of these machines on the left-hand side of the photo, the water machine, to fill jugs. Imagine how many times you would have to do that. 92% of residents, even though they may have water delivered by a truck or pick it up, have it hauled in themselves, they didn't perceive the water as being of good enough quality to drink. So they're still purchasing bottled water. And these are people where 83% of the residents live below the poverty line. And they're spending 20% of their total household income on water, where the EPA says that amount should be at 2%. Next slide, please. And then the additional burden of water storage practices. So this water that's delivered, it has to be stored somewhere. So for example, the primary way of storing it is in a tank, the image to the left, the big black tank. And then there's these pilas, these structures that have below ground where water is stored, kind of like a little mini swimming pool, if you will. And then you have 55-gallon barrels, and you have wells. But maintaining the sufficient amount of residual chlorine in order to prevent the growth of bacteria, microorganisms, that's a complicated process in a water treatment plant, much less someone trying to do that at home. And the example in the middle, you see the open area. Storage tanks, as well as pilas and these barrels, we find that times are not properly sealed, allowing dust to come in, birds to nest, and etc. And on top of that, the cleaning, the process, the time to do this, 40% of residents said that they never had cleaned their water storage tank. And that's how many, and we know that has to be underreported. So you can think of, on top of the water quality being put into a tank, a 7-foot storage tank that you would have to crawl into and clean. Is that something you could imagine yourself doing every month? Next slide, please. So that leads to health injustice. A colonial resident shared a regular part of life is having diarrhea, stomach cramps, stomach pain, bloated stomach. We think, would we want to live with that every single day, just being normal? Having a cup of mint tea or ginger tea, not to relax us, but just to settle our stomach. 56% of the homes where we tested water for free residual chlorine, turbidity, or E. coli did not meet the EPA standard. And I should note, when you don't have access to public water, there is no EPA standard. It's not tested on a regular basis. And on top of this, in addition to these common ailments, there's the fear of day-to-day burdens of what's going to happen to me. Brushing your teeth with tank water, inhalating the water during showering, using a washcloth and rubbing your skin, and what are you particularly doing to that rash that you have? Not being able to maintain a lawn or grass in a desert landscape that's already dusty, which can contribute to asthma and allergies. And one resident, as I walked into her home and she had a sink full of dirty dishes, explained to me that she wasn't lazy. It was just that they collect dishes over the course of the day and they wash them once a day. So if I saw anything running around, she was sorry. And I thought, she shouldn't have to live this way, but it's a decision. And there's also a great sense of people trying to conserve water and their own agency of using gray water to flush toilets. And lastly, what I want to share is that people want to still have a sense of community. There are many pets, dogs running around the colonias, and folks weren't willing to own a dog personally, but they wanted a community dog because no one wanted to be responsible for the vet bills that come when the dogs are drinking water that could be potentially contaminated. Next slide, please. So the many lessons that I learned from the colonias are that people are working hard to find solutions to make their lives better. And I'd like to thank the project promotora, Vicenta Plasencia, as well as the research assistants and many faculty and the University of Texas at El Paso that supported this work and believed in it when a time when folks were thinking, how many people really care about folks not having water in colonias? And I think today's meeting says, we do, we care. And what can we do about this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. First, let me clarify a mistake. I invited you to the audience to submit questions into chat. It turns out you don't have access to chat, but you do have access to the Q&A. So please post your questions there. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Christy Pullen-Fednick, who is a senior scientist and director of science and data at the Natural Resources Defense Council. She has extensive experience at the intersection of science and public policy with goals to advance data-driven, health protective, community-oriented solutions. That her work integrates and leverages health and environmental data to advance protections for peoples and communities disproportionately impacted by drinking water contamination. Welcome, Christy.
Great, thank you so much. That's a wonderful introduction. So as you heard, I'm Christy Pullen-Fednick, and today my talk is going to focus on the ways in which the right to safe drinking water is watered down for communities that are seen as existing on the margins, BIPOC communities, low-income communities, and low-access communities, and we've heard a bit about this already today. Though my talk's going to center on drinking water quality, I also want to be sure to acknowledge that quality is not the only issues that many communities face. We've already heard and discussed a little bit about access, but I also want to stress that water affordability is also a significant area of concerns for many people in this country. I'm not going to talk about that today, but just want to make sure that that's flagged for folks. So, in the infamous words of George Wallace's 1963 inaugural address, segregation would exist then, the next day, and forever. And even though he's cited as having regretted those words, the sentiment in his speech continued to reverberate today. While we sometimes think about segregation as being a part of the past, it is still alive and well today and can impact every aspect of our lives. So what does this have to do with drinking water in the present day? Well, community experiences, particularly the mass poisonings that happened in places like Flint and Newark, have demonstrated that equal protections under the law are not necessarily being afforded. To examine this more, though, I teamed up with the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, an environmental justice group, umbrella group, and Coming Clean to determine the extent to which disparities existed in drinking water quality across the nation. Using data from the Environmental Protection Agency, we found that nearly 40% of the US population, or about 130 million people, were served by drinking water systems that violated the Safe Drinking Water Act between 2016 and 2019. We also found that all 50 states had at least one system in violation of the law during that time. In addition to these macro level statistics, though, we also wanted to explore whether violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act followed similar patterns that we saw of disproportionate burdens that we know to exist for air, soil, and other types of contamination. The result of this partnership and collaborative effort was our report, Watered Down Justice. The report was a few years in the making and used data analysis and storytelling to understand the ways in which various communities interact with drinking water in the present moment. We used drinking water violation data from the EPA and social vulnerability data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for our analysis. Our analysis revealed that in drinking water violations, as assessed through a couple of different metrics, were statistically related to lower socioeconomic status, increased housing and transportation vulnerability, and increased social vulnerability associated with minority status and language. To further understand this interaction, we also explored the ways in which the relationships played out geographically. Looking at the race variable, which had the highest correlation in our assessment, we found that the geographic distribution of high rates of violations and social vulnerability due to the ways in which our society perceives race was not balanced across the country. As you can see in this map, which shows increasing rates of violations on the y-axis and increasing populations of color on the x-axis, place really matters. There were some places like Pennsylvania that had high rates of violations across the entire state, but had different racial makeups depending on where you resided. The golden color in the west reflects a largely white population with high rates of violation, which could indicate that other variables such as poverty could be at play. And then the darker colored areas in the east reflect higher rates of violations with higher percentages of the population that are people of color. When we look for locations with high rates of violations and percentages of the population that are people of color, we find that the Northeast and then many counties in the Southwest, which are very similar to the maps that we saw earlier about water access, had the highest relative rates of violations and percentages of the population that were people of color. When we look beyond the rates of violations, we also see that race and place matter for enforcement of the law. Our analysis found that drinking water systems in counties with higher proportions of the population that were people of color stayed out of compliance longer for more contaminants and remained out of compliance even when enforcement actions were taken. We see a strikingly similar geographic pattern here as well. Taken on its own, some of these results could be quite depressing, but one of the things that we really wanted to do was highlight some of the solution sets and identify the solution sets in order to elevate and support communities around the country that are facing these issues. Our research allowed us to identify specific requests that communities would want in moving forward, understanding that disproportionately impacted communities must be identified, engaged, and supported as active partners, that water contamination must be prevented from occurring in the first place, that funding for water infrastructure projects must be made immediately available with priorities given to communities of color and other environmental justice communities. The small systems must be strengthened. The Safe Drinking Water Act must be enforced with an assumption of the undercurrent of structural racism that creates an unequal playing field for different communities. Finally, the health threats and impacts of water contamination must be assessed, disclosed, and plainly explained. So to that end, we were able to take the information that we were able to assess and the data we were able to collect and engage with the press to help build awareness and provide heightened support for the work happening on the ground. We were fortunate to receive both national and local coverage, particularly in Michigan, where many folks have been extremely hardly hit by the drinking water crises. Awareness building and press coverage is not the end goal, however. We also wanted to leverage our work to affect meaningful change. And we were really encouraged this summer by the ways in which federal lawmakers used or cited our report in legislation and platform building. In July, Representative Tlaib of Michigan cited our report when she announced that the House had passed the Moving Forward Act, which authorized $22.5 billion over 5 years to address lead service line replacements across the country. Also in July, Senator Kamala Harris, now vice presidential candidate Senator Kamala Harris, also co-authored an op-ed that discussed racism and disparities in access to safe drinking water, where she called for a $10 billion affordability program and making a $220 billion investment in clean and safe drinking water initiatives. This movement, particularly at the national level, really highlights for me the importance of community-centered and action-oriented partnerships that combine technical skill and the expertise of lived experiences to bring about the change that marginalized communities deserve. So in closing, I just want to express my extraordinary gratitude and deep thanks to many of the groups I've worked with and or been inspired by on this journey. In particular, I'd like to call out Michelle Roberts at EJHA, Steve Taylor at Coming Clean, who are my co-authors, and Yvette Jordan with the New Caucus. And I encourage all of you to find each of these groups on the web and support them in any way you can. You can also feel to reach out to me if you'd like to discuss this project or any other projects in detail. And I look forward to the continued discussion. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christy. That was fascinating. Our next speaker is Daryl Behill. He is the co-director of Water and Tribes in the Colorado River Basin and the Water Administrator administrator for the Jicarilla Apache Nation. He serves as chair of the Water is Life Tribal Partnership. He's official spokesperson for and past chairman of the Colorado River 10 Tribes Partnership and a member of the coordination committee of the next steps of the Colorado River Basin. He's going to help us switch gears to the West and large river basin management. Welcome, Daryl. Daryl, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that, Kathy. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending where you're at. It's still morning here, so glad to be with all of you folks here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity that the board has offered in terms of me being able to share a little bit about, the tribal perspective, and of course, I don't speak for, all tribes, but, the work that we're doing with the Water and Tribes Initiative really is looking at how we start to create a mechanism to convene 29 sovereigns that are in the Colorado River Basin. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I just wanted to create a little bit of perspective before, I go into my conversation about universal access to clean water. And that's just, to lay a little bit of groundwork about what's happening in the Colorado River Basin. As most of you know, or maybe you don't know, and that's why I think it's important to highlight, the Colorado River Basin is home to 41 million people, 7 basin states, the federal government, Mexico is involved in the management of the Colorado River as well. 7th largest economy in the world. And then in terms of scale and issues that are going on, my co-presenters before me, those black areas is a large part the Colorado River Basin. As I mentioned, there's 29 distinct sovereigns in the Colorado River Basin, and that have been there for a millennia. My background is also, I'm part Jemez Pueblo and part Zia Pueblo, and my ancestors have been here living sustainably for thousands of years. And I think that's really important to know. The other thing that's really important to know about the Colorado River and the tribes in the Colorado River is that they have settled water rights either through the settlement process or through decree of 20 to 25% of the total volume of the Colorado River. And so that's really important to understand, because as we start to talk about social injustice or economic development inequity and opportunities that aren't afforded to tribes in the Southwest, it's really important to understand the context of what we're talking about, because the law of a river is composed of a complex array of law that not only is federal law, international law, state law, local law, municipal law, and then on top of that you put tribal settlements and decrees and have an expectation that we're supposed to figure this out. The Colorado River River is at a real pivotal point right now, because we're in the process of looking back at the operational guidelines which operate the Colorado River mostly as a plumbing system, not acknowledging that it's an ecosystem and that it's home to millions and millions of people, and how do we integrate those processes. And so the 07 guideline process, the tribes were not included in that process in any shape or form. We were not invited either. The 2009 Bureau of Reclamation supply demand study, again, a partnership with the federal government and the 7 basin states, excluded participation or was not inclusive of tribal participation. So we started to look at, with 25% of the volume of rivers, 29 distinct sovereigns, maybe there should be some room, in terms of the next set of guidelines that are going to start to be negotiated at the beginning of the year. And one of the curious things that we found out in the process that we undertook of interviewing over 100 different individuals from states, water providers, tribes, Mexico, the federal government, we really saw, the value, the personal value that people have to the Colorado River and their personal connection to it. And we quickly saw that, the existing law and policy of the Colorado River was absolutely oppositional at a get-go in terms of, what people really felt about the river. And so the conversations that we've been involved in terms of just the recognition of tribal water rights, the recognition of tribal sovereignty, the recognition of tribal self-determination, just given, again, those graphics that were shown earlier about those Black areas, that's where I live. And I think it's really important to understand that background, and that right now, and so all those things have been happening, over time in the Colorado River Basin in terms of, the lack of participation on the tribal side, the lack of access to infrastructure, the lack of access to governmental programs and those kind of things, because we absolutely understood, that those weren't built for, a domestic sovereign or access for domestic sovereigns. And so they've been really ineffective. And we can go through numerous examples, including the Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project, where we're 70,000 to 80,000 Navajos still haul water on a daily basis here in America. And some of those statistics that were quoted earlier, absolutely, we highlight in this document that's in front of you right now. And so what COVID has done is it's absolutely exasperated, the conversation that it was already started in terms of, and highlighted, the need, for a conversation about the inequities in terms of the basic resources that tribes have access to. And I've shared this before in other talks, but I'm showing my age, but I'm 58 years old. And I was in my Pueblo, Zia Pueblo, I was one of the first people to use, indoor plumbing, because before that we used outdoor plumbing. And so that's just in my lifetime that this is happening. And so, what has COVID done? It's shown again, those inequities that we've been talking about, that, and the Black Lives Matter movement highlighted that even to a broader degree in terms of just the gross inequities in terms of social justice across this country. And what is it that we can do right now, given the opportunity in this moment in time, to actually forward a conversation about changing access, especially for tribes, to federal money and federal dollars, and redefining, what trust responsibility is as well. And I work with an incredible group of our leadership team that we have these conversations. And I think, what's really, really, meaningful and touching to me is that, the river, the Colorado River and its tributaries gives this conversation voice, and it gives it awareness and about how everything really, truly is connected. And so my Water and Tribes Initiative has undergone this process now of a universal access to clean water in the Colorado River Basin. Why? Of course, we see with the panelists that this is a national conversation, but my leadership group and the conversation, we know the Colorado River Basin really, really well. And so we're gathering the data right now to hopefully so that we can make some significant impacts, with the, hopefully the change of administration and have something available as soon as that happens, so that we can, for us, it's a matter of life and death. We're talking policy and access to governmental different resources that aren't available to us traditionally. And I go back to Navajo Gallup Water Supply Project, because right now it's at a deficit of $250 million, and where are we going to make that up? The other thing that happens too often is that, and that's led to life and death situations in reality because of COVID, are these conversations of, well, we need to have a settlement before we provide you, tribal sovereign, access to clean water. And, that's backwards to us. You know, it should just be access to clean water. And so our Water and Tribes Initiative really wants to hopefully highlight, you know, the Colorado River Basin and our experience of it to hopefully affect this conversation in a meaningful way to the broader public, because as mentioned before, you know, those Black areas are where we live. And, you know, and we're at a moment in time with the renegotiation of the operational guidelines to not do what we've done before, but to actually look at who we are as human beings and make sure that all policy conversations are inclusive of voices that need to be heard, including the science community, cultural values, and conservation values. Those need to be included. So when we're talking about, you know, the opportunity that exists in the Colorado River Basin, we're talking about who are we going to be in terms of, who are we going to be as human beings in terms of the policy with the Colorado River that impacts everybody, given that water is life. So thank you so much for letting me share that real quickly.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Our last presenter is Eric Tate, an associate professor of geography at the University of Iowa. His work lies at the confluence of environmental hazards in society, primarily through development of geospatial models. He's looked at indicators of vulnerability, resilience, and sustainability, and flood hazard mitigation. Welcome, Eric.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to focus my talk on sort of justice and equity concerns about who lives in the floodplain. And I've kind of structured it to include some sort of big questions that I think are relevant in this area. My name's Eric Tate, and I study flood hazards, okay, and its intersection with social vulnerability. So my perspective is that, you know, there's multiple dimensions to flood disasters, but we don't always acknowledge them, right? So we put a lot of emphasis into understanding the physical dimensions and modeling the flow of water and its impacts. So, you know, in the physical realm, it's dominated by engineering analysis. We focus a lot on managing, trying to control and reduce impacts through insurance and disaster assistance. And so this tends to be the realm of floodplain managers and emergency managers. But certainly a really important dimension is the social dimension. And we find that, you know, impacts from flooding, who's exposed, varies quite a bit across populations. But whose job is it to account for these dynamics? So of these multiple, dimensions, our strategies analyses don't often reflect them. So here's a cartoon from the Army Corps of Engineers. It's talking about essentially a bunch of different strategies of structural mitigation and non-structural mitigation that can take a high level of initial flood risk and bring it down to a low level of residual risk. And this has been the dominant approach forever, you know, the last 50 years or so. But do the benefits of these risk reduction activities accrue to all populations? Do they accrue to all places? These are important questions to ask if you're thinking, you know, about the social equity of these investments. So the first question that I'd like to highlight is what is exposed to floods? And, you know, FEMA has been involved for quite a long time in floodplain mapping. There's now, you know, coverage across the United States in some areas, really highly resolved analyses where we can understand the depth and expanse of flooding and its intersection with built environment assets. But lately, there's been even greater advances in the ability to have, you know, continental scale mapping. It eliminates some of the challenges with FEMA maps where there's gaps in data quality, you know, differences in data quality and gaps in spatial coverage across the country, and also bringing into the play both fluvial hazard, pluvial hazard, future flood conditions. So the First Street Foundation is leading a lot of these efforts. And, you know, with this information, you can then combine with where people live and start to build national maps of flood exposure. And so, you know, and this map certainly dominated by the lower Mississippi River Valley and the Gulf and Atlantic coast and the Central California Valley for which places are most exposed to floods. But if you're trying to incorporate social dimensions, then we also need to measure social vulnerability to floods. And through the last 15 years of social vulnerability research, a few leading metrics have emerged, one from the University of South Carolina called the Social Vulnerability Index, and that's mapped here in blue and red across the United States. The Centers for Disease Control has also come up with their own measure, and I think Christy was talking about that in her talk. And the HUD also uses, through their CDBG program, a low to moderate income indicator for prioritizing investments. All of these measures of social vulnerability are descriptive, but we really don't know to what extent they explain who is exposed, what kinds of outcomes. They're certainly not focused on flood hazards. And, there's not a real focus on, application to mitigation versus recovery. How do these differ? How do the populations of, influence in these areas differ? So we can take these measures and then try and understand who's exposed to floods. We do have a better understanding of who is most vulnerable. This is some quotes from a recent National Academies report on urban flooding in the US, and which finds, unsurprisingly, I think, that impacts from flooding are disproportionate. And occupancy in flood-prone areas is disproportionate as well. So characteristics around age and socioeconomic status, home ownership, and race and ethnicity. So in my work, I try and take both of these dimensions, both flood exposure and social vulnerability. And here we're looking at spatial clustering across the United States. The red areas indicate where both flood exposure and surrounding social vulnerability are high. You can see this is dominated by rural areas that intersect with sort of racialized poverty. The blue areas are places with high flood hazard, but low social vulnerability. And I think by contrasting the blue and the red, they're both high flood exposure areas, but at extremes of social vulnerability. And so we use these places to try and ask the question, okay, which kinds of populations dominate in these areas? And that's what's reflected in the table here. And so the way to read this table is, if you're going from anywhere in the US into one of these blue or red areas, this is the average change in these indicators. So entering these blue or red areas of high flood exposure, the percentage of mobile homes on average increases by 156%. Likewise, indicators of race change quite a bit as well. So this really jives with the findings of the previous speakers about this confluence of race and socioeconomic status as leading indicators, and housing as leading indicators of social vulnerability. Okay, with respect to water. When you have these measures, we can start to ask questions about who benefits from flood recovery and mitigation. I mean, we can call them recovery and mitigation. I see them as resources. These are investments. Who's benefiting from these? And there's greater amounts of disaster outcome data from programs like the Individual Assistance Program, National Flood Insurance Program, that are more available at spatially, and it's really local scales. And so through examination of this, we're just beginning to understand who has the most unmet needs. But we can take these measures of social vulnerability and try and start to ask questions about how equitable these programs are. What about the processes for applying? Who is eligible to gain these resources? So typically the measures that are examined are things like income and physical assets, leading to evaluation based on credit score and benefit cost ratios. How equitable, how representative are these measures of socially vulnerable populations? What kinds of outcome measures do we examine? Often we look at like total counts of damaged homes or the total economic damage, not really looking into what is the relative impact on these households. The few studies that have looked at these kinds of things, FEMA had an affordability study. There's a report from E&E News this summer that looked at the Small Business Association loan program and found inequities based on income and race. So we have these inequities, they're heavily documented in the research. And if we keep investing into recovery and mitigation the way we're doing it, it's likely to perpetuate these inequities. Finally, how can we then take this knowledge and integrate it into flood decision making? How can we make equity part of how we're dealing with floods? So equity, in its definition, is not necessarily about allocating resources equally across populations, which is a great goal. We certainly don't have that now. It's really about, fulfilling human needs. So one approach, this has actually been taken by Harris County Flood Control District. They use the CDC social vulnerability model, and they use that as one criterion in a multi-criteria analysis to prioritize which mitigation projects were going to happen first. Okay, there's been some pushback on that. Using now partially an equity measure instead of primarily or previously cost-benefit analyses is going to change the the rankings of who and which projects get funded first or get implemented first. But this is just beginning, and so there's a need to develop best practices. So those are, I think, some big questions I see around sort of social vulnerability to floods and equity. And thank you for your time.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Eric, and all of our speakers. So a virtual hand clap for all of them. We're now going to turn, we've got about 15 minutes for some questions and time to converse. So we're going to invite virtually all of the 5 presenters back on view here. And while the board members are teeing up questions. So as a reminder to board members, if you'd like to ask a question of our presenters, one or more, raise your hand and I will call on you. But while we're waiting for that, I'd like to invite our presenters to comment on or ask questions of each other. Anything that you heard you'd like to learn more about, or provide some commentary on. And I think we can do this, just unmute and jump in. I think we still have a small enough group here. So I'll pause for a minute and give folks time to jump in.
This is Daryl, and I really wanted to acknowledge, the conversation about the colonias. We have a couple of tribes in the basin, Tohoto O'odham and the Cocopah, which are right on the border, in Arizona of Mexico. And so, those conversations, and 30% of the Colorado River Basin is Hispanic or Latino, and and there's incredible social justice issues in the Salton Sea that are still unresolved. And so I really appreciated that. The other thing that it really highlighted that I wanted to share with the board was, just the understanding too about federal trust land on most reservations in terms of the real estate conversation. You hear terms like, well, that reservation looks like it's in a third world country. Well, it's in our country. And it's real important to understand why a lot of Native Americans, engage in the purchase of mobile homes, because it's trust land and they can never own the real estate beneath them. So, conventional mortgage real estate, principles and law, aren't applicable. And so the quickest way for housing is, of course, the trailer. And for us, again, all the inherent issues that revolve around a trailer too. So thank you for bringing that to mind for me so that I could share that.
Thank you. I see that Nusha from the board has a question, so I'll invite Nusha to unmute and ask her question.
Thank you, Kathy. And Thank you to the panelists, such interesting and valuable insights. I really appreciated all of them and all the information that was provided. Daryl, this question is for you. You know, it is often a challenge to find a way to engage various indigenous communities in research, partly because sometimes it's, you don't know how to approach the problem. You want to make sure you're respectful of the, the issues and the challenges and the sensitivities. What do you think is the best way to incorporate some of these real challenges into academic world that can have real impacts while engaging with various sovereign nations across the country? And I know that one challenge I have noticed is, obviously these are sovereign nations, they have different problems and challenges, and they feel you want to make sure you don't take a problem from one sovereign nation and sort of applies to another one. So you want to be very, very thoughtful of how you're doing the engagement. So I would like to know what your thoughts are on this.
Sure, thank you so much. And that's a great question, Nisha. And, I think, I get teased about this, but early on, for the last 10 years, that's part of, my work has been, just, building some basis of relatedness. And one of the fundamental things that, I like to hopefully engage and share with people is that if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. And, we have over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States, each distinct sovereign entities. And so there is no tribal solution, because that would mean that you went to each one of those tribes and got their feedback on what the policy should be. And I think that's part of that's a heart of one of the issues. The other one is, of course, the recognition of tribal sovereignty. I think, there's a lot of speak about it, but it's not reflected in any policy structures. And in this conversation, access to resources. It's very cumbersome. We know that it wasn't meant, they weren't built. Those processes weren't built for, how you partner with your domestic sovereign and helping them live on a day-to-day basis and those kind of things. And then the other thing is that the recognition of where we're at in this capacity divide at a governance level. 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, a lot of those constitutional governments were adopted by Indian tribes, not necessarily because tribes wanted that or it was in their best interest. It was about control and access to resources. And so when you're talking about most policy and what's happening right now, we're finding that, yes, we need to have these conversations. And let's deal with them now when we have the opportunity, rather than do what we traditionally do, is punt and then circle back when there's a crisis and then, oh, well, here it is again. That's kind of the conventional wisdom, but that's built into the fabric of the policy. And I think that's one of the things we really want to highlight, that if that's the case and we have an opportunity to weave something different, let's include in the Colorado River Basin those 29 sovereigns, but there's not a structure that exists for those sovereigns to talk to each other or integrate or interact with each other. And is that going to happen, from the federal government or those 7 basin states? No, it's got to be, a kind of internal driven of those sovereigns. And based on a recent sign-on letter to Secretary Bernhardt, regarding their 17 sovereigns in the Colorado River Basin, who signed on expressing their concerns about this renegotiation process. There was no formal way to do that. And those 17 sovereigns did not get a reply from Secretary Bernhardt or even Commissioner or the Reclamation Commissioner as well. So I think, when you're talking about this, it's absolutely about building a foundation of a recognition of where the reality of where tribes really are at. And when we have those conversations, it starts to make sense that, inside of tribal reservations, we're on the best of the worst list, and it just continues because, those governance structures protect themselves inside our own governances as well. And so, and I think that at the heart of it is being able to have a recognition and a sense of relatedness. And that's what we're kind of perpetuating in the Colorado River Basin.
Thanks a lot, Daryl. I wonder if any of our other speakers would like to react to Nusha's question. And then I have David Wagner up next to ask his question. Any other thoughts about this space, Christy?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I agree 100% with Daryl. The community in Newark is not going to be the same as the community in Pittsburgh, and it's not the same as a community in Houston. And so I think that as you're, really getting into community-centered and community-oriented and community needs-centered work, then understanding that the research that we're doing is at the service of those communities. It's about building relationships. It's about long-term investment. It's about, not just coming in with the issue that you care about and then moving away. It's also about figuring out and identifying and help to understand the other issues that communities are facing. And so we don't exist in vacuums, right? And so we may have water issues, but we may also have healthcare issues. We may also have, violence issues. There's so many things to really think about. And so I think that as folks are really, committing or wanting to do work in and with communities, how to establish those relationships first and foremost, know that you can commit to them in the long term, and then invest in helping that specific community build what it is that it's trying to build. Hopefully, Shakovi, I know Dr. Wilson will talk a bit about this too, but that's something that I really see as being essential to this work.
Great, thank you so much. Dave Wagner, please jump in.
Great. Thank you all to all our speakers. This has been a fascinating discussion this morning. And still not working. There we go. Can you hear me now?
You're good.
Okay, good. Okay. First off, thanks to all the speakers this morning. This has been a great way to go. Daryl, my friend, it's good to see you from the state to the west of you. I guess I have a lot of questions, but I want to focus one to Yolanda first. When I was working on the Hill in the Obama administration, there were several programs at EPA and the Department of Interior that were focused on trying to provide funding to the border communities for water-related infrastructure. The challenge we had was that because the colonias by nature are unincorporated, that there was no vehicle to interact with them in a way that we could actually get money for water infrastructure to these people. And it's not dissimilar to some of the challenges we've had working with some of the tribes. My question is in your experience of reviewing these programs and the colonial issues, have you come up with some ideas on how we can assess this or approach this issue so that we can get the resources to them to help address the problem? Thank you.
Well, that's a really great question. And I have two quick stories to share with you. When I was out in the colonias talking with folks, at the same time, the USDA had awarded funds for water systems for a public water system pipes to be laid. And it was really interesting because you saw the trenches and you heard about the pipes, but the Lower Valley Water District, which was the closest to where these communities were going to get water, the developers got involved and said, oh, we want to now, since there's going to be a public water supply and sanitation, we need to get bigger pipes. We need to do this. We need to spec this out. So one I would say is who you're talking to, because there was local community members who had organized, and they didn't have a voice. They weren't listened to, frankly. It was like, let's listen to the water utilities and let's listen to the developers, but let's not actually listen to the people's needs that we're trying to meet. So one I would say is like, find out who the local organizations are to build up how Christy said. You have to spend the time building relationships and find out who is going to make these decisions and who can ensure that this is going to be sustainable development, which is one of the questions that came through the window. Is you have to work on the ground. Just writing a check, and I remember seeing the photos, the big check, and everyone's smiling, and years went by, nothing happened. So I think that's one, is giving more, frankly, and I'm not saying this towards you, but more respect to the people and communities. They really can manage this. That I think that would really be helpful.
Great, thank you very much. And Yolanda, did you have a question as well? Your hand is raised.
I was just going to add on to Krista the importance of, and I think of building these relationships and how long that takes. And it's not a research project; it's a lifetime commitment to communities. And I think that is why sometimes we don't see as much research in this in academic circles, because I probably shouldn't say this, and I'm at an institution that does support this, but that's not really a good road for tenure. But it's research that's important, it's applied, and having that support from institutions to say that we believe this is going to make a difference.
Great, thank you very much. We have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to ask each one of our panelists. There was one thing that you think academic organizations, institutions could do that would help provide more contributions to knowledge in this space, what would it be?
So, yeah, so I'll start. I don't think there's one thing. I think unless what you the part of the problem is that these are dispersed communities, right? But if I'm going to name something that I think we desperately need to work on, it was noted in the question that most of us did correlation analysis. That's largely because we don't have very good data. It is really hard to get a handle on what the actual situation is. So even if you're trying to do quantitative research that can inform you so you're not asking really dumb questions when you start the conversation with these communities, you can't get it right now. So trying to understand what is the data that we need and how do we produce it would be one place to start.
Thank you. Excellent. Others?
I think Yolanda also just touched on this. I mean, we need to change and shift the paradigm by which, tenure decisions are made, funding decisions are made, what's considered valuable research and, what's considered a valuable use of your time. So, having faculty hiring searches that are explicitly looking for people that you're going to give, again, tenured positions based upon, the work that they're doing in communities, or, extending those tenured decisions to folks that are, doing this work in that way. And so I think that if the Academy continues to have the value centered on things that are outside of what are of value to communities, that we're going to continue to perpetuate, the parachuting behavior, the, other ways in which, scientists come in and don't necessarily actually impact those communities.
Great, thanks. Eric, any thoughts here?
Yeah, so on the data thing, I kind of want to switch the focus to our government organizations. We don't have the data at scale to be able to do good equity analysis. So a lot of the disaster programs, they may collect information based on income or whether you're a renter, but many of these presentations have shown these inequities based on race. And we don't have that information from a lot of these, at least the flood disaster programs. At institutions, academic institutions, I echo sort of, what counts? Does engagement count? Does interdisciplinary research count? As junior professors who often are at the cutting edge of what's going on and have the most enthusiasm to do that, but then get their hands slapped if they try and move too much in that direction.
Thank you. Daryl and/or Yolanda, do you have a 20-second contribution here? I'm sorry, I've already eaten into people's break time. Very brief.
If I could real quickly,
Yes.
For us, absolutely integral part of what we do, active partnership with, University of Arizona, University of Utah, University of New Mexico, University of Colorado, ASU, and some of the best science in the basin is in the Colorado River Basin, and so make sure that that's connected to where it needs to get connected to, and looking at the creation actually with all those institutions of a new paradigm in the creation of leadership in the basin. So looking at the creation of a leadership institute that all those learning institutions are interested in.
Thank you. Yolanda.
Mine would be to continue interdisciplinary research. In this water space, we have to be working with engineers, working with medical professionals, clinicians, biochemists, so forth, and have those conversations at our campuses, and frankly, meetings like this, acknowledging that, developing these relationships. So Stephen and I were kind of talking before this started, this is such a big problem, and yes, national data is extremely important, but each institution working together, a dream, so that we can all address these problems when we think of scale. This has to be, a scalier approach.
Wonderful. Thank you all. We're going to now take a break and be back promptly in 12 minutes. Thank you. See you very soon. Welcome everyone back from break. We've had a remarkable and mind-engaging conversation, set of information provided this morning. I want to thank again our amazing presenters. You will be seeing them again, so stay tuned for more. But first, at this point, we're going to invite, we've invited three panelists to discuss with us further areas of issues and environment where issues of environmental justice and water have been underappreciated or understudied. So I am going to ask each of our three presenters to introduce themselves first instead of having to listen to me. And in addition to doing introductions, I'd like to invite them each to share just a few thoughts about what it is that got them involved in this type of work in their life and career. I think that the three panelists can just unmute and we can start in any order. Would one of you like to start?
Sure. Hi, this is Radhika. I'm happy to start if that works for the others. So Kobe and Nisha.
Thank you, Radhika. Charge ahead.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Radhika Fox. I'm the CEO of the U.S. Water Alliance. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity to join you. I think I'm the one non-academic amongst you. And so I want to thank Nusha Ajami, who's on the board, for the invitation, and Kathy, to you and the whole team for putting this together. Really excited to join you. The U.S. Water Alliance is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to securing a sustainable water future for all. And the way that the Alliance works is we really are trying to bring together all who have a stake in our nation's water future, whether it's the water agencies that deliver drinking water, wastewater service, community-based organizations, environmental groups, researchers, philanthropy, to together identify common ground solutions for those water challenges that no one sector can solve alone. And if we think about the theme of today's conversation, environmental justice, it is such an intersectional issue, and we need intersectional strategies to really forge success. I wanted to offer a couple of thoughts, and I wanted to actually start, as I was thinking about today's conversation, I went back this morning to kind of the EPA definition of environmental justice, and let me read that to you. EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So I think as we think about the definition of environmental justice and the issues we're tackling today, I think we need to remember the history from where the quest for environmental justice came from, right? We know that race is historically and to the current day, the single biggest predictor of the siting of environmental hazards, whether it's bus depots or whether it's also wastewater treatment facilities. I'm calling in from the Bay Area, and it is in the African-American Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood that the wastewater treatment plant is located that treats 80% of the city's wastewater, right? So race has historically been a predictor of environmental injustice, environmental hazards. And it also, as Stephen's presentation a little while ago showed us, that race is also one of the biggest predictors of access to water, and that we know we face disproportionate impacts in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. But what I wanted to offer to the Academy, as you all are thinking about your role in advancing environmental justice issues, is let's think about expanding that to be not only about environmental justice, which is critically important, but really how do we advance equity through the context of water management? And for us at the U.S. Water Alliance, when we say equity, what we mean is that we want every single person, regardless of race or income or geography, to have the conditions that allow them to participate and fully prosper in America. For us, water equity is achieved by ensuring, one, that everyone has safe, reliable water access. And we heard a lot of wonderful presentations around strategies and challenges around that. We also, though, have to make sure that the benefits of investment in water are shared equally, whether it's through workforce development strategies, opening up the business opportunities, supporting neighborhood improvements through those water infrastructure. So it's about access, it's about sharing the benefits, and then it really is also about how do we ensure that our communities are resilient in the face of a changing climate, because we know that so much of climate stress is experienced through the medium of water. And finally, we have to make sure that all communities really have a stake, a real stake in the decision-making when it comes to water management in this country. I would love, as we get into the discussion, to talk with you about some of the work that we've been doing. We're working with 17 cities around the country on defining water equity for their community and developing roadmaps around the strategies that they're pursuing, and then really implementing a lot of policies and practices that I think would be strengthened and bolstered, with stronger partnerships with the Science Board and the Academy. So let me pause there because I think I'm at my 5 minutes, and pass it on to one of the other speakers.
Thank you so very much. Isha, I'll invite you to share a few opening remarks, and then we'll return to everyone for more insights from you each. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It was a very instructive set of talks that we listened to today, and that I'm happy to respond to and add my own insights. I'm a professor at University of California at Berkeley, and I've been working in the water space, mostly in developing countries, but also in California, in the Central Valley, which you all saw on everybody's map, has a spatial cluster of water injustices. Also working in the California Central Valley for several years. I started out my life working in developing country contexts, Nepal, India, Tanzania, parts of Mexico. And it was really my students who pointed out to me that you didn't have to travel that far to see developing country conditions. You could go to the Central Valley. And that's actually what brought me into working in the Central Valley or in the US on water injustices and water inequities. I think some of the talks that we saw this morning very much show how right my students were. So there are three aspects I would like to talk about today in my 5 minutes, very briefly. And I want to focus on the three aspects that influence the world of academic research and teaching, because that's the space I come from and therefore can speak to. And also, we were also asked to discuss specifically how research and science can advance the cause of social justice and water justice. So I would like to talk about 3 points. One, which is a bit of a barrier, and two, which are opportunities. Okay, so let me first discuss the barrier. Even today, even after the horrific summer we've been through and our reckoning with race as a nation and as a community, even today, I would say that the explicit discussion of racial injustice in access to water or land produces amongst many of our colleagues what I can only call a squirm factor, meaning the desire to look at injustice or deprivation as stemming from something other than historical racism is very, very high. So for example, when you go to the Central Valley, where many people are Spanish speaking, you have Latinx communities, you see a strong predictor of poor quality water and the race and ethnicity. People will often, excellent people, well-intentioned people will come back to you and say, well, how do you know that you can really isolate race as a factor, as a causal explanation? How do you know that it's not, quote unquote, just low income people? How do you know that it's not primarily the lack of TMF, technical, managerial, and financial capacity to run a small system? Maybe the primary problem is the size of the system. These are small systems, therefore they don't have the kind of economies of scale they need to treat nitrates and to treat microbiological contamination. But what I want to say is that the world is not such a simple world where race is actually isolatable from all of its attendant factors. And I wonder whether we should be asking this question, whether we should say control for every covariate until you can absolutely isolate the specific impact of the racial component. When all of these things have historically, low incomes, marginalization, etc., have co-occurred with race throughout this country's history. And in the water systems and in the organization of the water systems, no less than anything else. So I just want to open up this conversation with a request to all of us not to shrink from the possibility that race is a major predictor and a major factor in explaining deprivation and historical water injustices, not just in the Central Valley that I know very well, but many other places. We should not be constantly looking for alternative explanations, anything but race. That will not help us. The second point I want to raise comes from, I think it was Stephen who said we should reimagine solutions. And I really, that resonated with me a lot. And I just want to throw out for our discussion a possible reimagination. I want to make an analogy with the primary school system. We have decided as a community, as a society, and as a nation that all children, regardless of their circumstances, need to go to school. The public education system, which is far from perfect, don't get me wrong, far from perfect, provides the opportunity for every child to go to school. And then we try to figure out how to pay for that public system. Why is it so difficult for us to treat clean water in the same way? Why are we asking for water systems to be, the talks this morning made it clear that where the public systems were absent is where water systems were often most in trouble. So why can we not think about water systems or clean water systems as something that the nation owes to all its citizens, to its entire population, and then we're going to figure out how to pay for it as a society, instead of looking to water systems, small water systems, under-resourced water systems, to come up with their own solution in minority communities, in non-English speaking communities, in low-resource communities, in communities that can't afford professional engineers with an engineering degree and actually have to have mom and pop volunteers from the community running the water system. We would never run our school systems that way. So why are we willing to run our water systems this way? And that's just a question I would like to open up for further thought and further discussion in the search for reimagining solutions. And the third comment I want to make comes from everybody this morning. We talked about data. I want to say that for us in the academic world, good data and the rigorous analysis of good data are all important. That is how we define ourselves. That is how we define our field. And I also want to acknowledge that in the most marginalized of places, you will always have inadequate data. Data collection takes resources, which is precisely what is lacking in these places. But at some point, do we not have to say, we have enough data to know what's going on? At some point, we have to say, yes, there are uncertainties, we need more data, we need more precision. Of course, but you know what? I can see the bigger picture with the data I have. So let me work with it and make that the question that drives my research instead of sheltering under the need for even more data before I can come to any kind of conclusion about what is important and what should be studied. I'm an academic through and through, and I'm not going to speak against data. I cannot do that, okay? But I do want to suggest that there comes a time where enough evidence has been gathered from multiple means where the lack of data is a problem, but it is not the driving problem. More technology to produce more beautiful data from more smaller and smaller places is not going to bypass the politics of the situation and give us a solution. So let's not go there, friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last, certainly not least, from my alma mater, Sokobi, please introduce yourself and inspire us with your thoughts.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate the previous speakers. You started getting me excited. You're gonna start taking me to church. I appreciate what you said because I say that all the time. And, you know, it's exciting to hear other people say that because it sounds like I feel like Don Quixote a lot. And I'll get to who I am, but feel like Don Quixote when I've been at the University of Maryland, but all of a sudden now this uprising against racism. Hey, Sokobi, what do you think? So the last 8 years, you didn't want to listen to me. But now we have an uprising against racism. Oh, that's racism all of a sudden. Oh, you want to listen to the expert on environmental justice. It's exhausting, y'all. It was exhausted before. It's even more exhausting now because I've been doing these kind of discussions, been on these panels, 2 or 3 or 4 panels a week, talking about how we address gender issues and racism. So I just want to say that I'm glad to be here, but I am tired, just to let y'all know. So I'm Sokobi Wilson, University of Maryland College Park. I'm an associate professor at the university. I run the program of community engagement, environmental justice and health. I'm also a member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, NEJAC. I am on the board of the Citizen Science Association. So the comments about inclusive science, action-oriented science, community-driven science are important. Former board member, Community Campus Partnerships for Health. We're talking about doing, community-driven partnerships, community-based work where the research is of the community, for the community, by the community. So I want to, slow down a little bit and reflect on what I heard earlier today. I really appreciate the earlier presentations. I think they were illustrative of some of the issues when we think about water. So water quantity, water quality, water accessibility, water affordability. As a member of NEJAC, we actually wrote a report, I think 2 years ago, in response to Flint water crisis, a water infrastructure report. And one of the panels that we heard in Minnesota, we had a panel on water issues in Minnesota a few years ago, where we had folks from Flint who came. We had folks who dealt with the spill in West Virginia, and also folks from Sand Branch outside of Dallas, a small hamlet of Black folks who are not connected to sewer and water infrastructure. So going back to, I think, the first speaker's presentation, if you look at 20% of our population, 18% of the population still lives in rural areas, more than likely, many of those folks are still on well water and septic tanks. To me, they don't have access to publicly regulated sewer and water infrastructure. That is an environmental justice issue. The lack of basic amenities is an environmental justice issue. If you only have septic tanks, if you only have well water, if your roads have not been paved, if you don't have proper ingress and egress, that's an EJ issue. Those communities are what we call pre-New Deal communities. But because of not just racism, which is baked into the walls of this country, because of racism, many of these communities do not have that infrastructure, even though they're paying taxes. In my early work in North Carolina with the West End Revitalization Association, we found that these post-slavery freedmen's neighborhoods, the town of Mebane, as it grew excluding those communities, right? And so some of the communities are in what we call the ETJ. So being unincorporated is very similar to being the ETJ. The ETJ is the extraterritorial jurisdiction. That's the area outside the town that the town still has purview over planning and zoning. You have no power if you live in the ETJ. It's almost like when you're the city edge, right? The city limits edge. Y'all know those communities, or been unincorporated. So you're unincorporated or you're in the ETJ. It's contamination without representation, because many of those same communities that don't have basic amenities are also where we put what? The landfill. We put the incinerator. I was just on gave testimony last night for a solar power plant. You think that's a great thing, right? In Archer, Florida, and the community didn't want it. And guess what? This historic Black community, for those who know the history of Florida and Rosewood, remember the race riots of Rosewood, many of those folks escaped, went to Archer, right? The area is unincorporated. Okay, it's unincorporated. My work in Mebane, those neighborhoods, guess what? They were either in the ETJ or they were what? Unincorporated. So when it comes to colonials, things about brothers and sisters on reservations, many of those areas are what? Unincorporated. I do work in Uniontown, Alabama. Some of you may know about Uniontown, 20 miles from Selma. It has a landfill that takes in trash from 33 states. The landfill's built on top of a plantation. They don't have sewer and water infrastructure. When they flush their toilet, their waste goes to the containment pond. The liquid effluent is sprayed on the grounds. Guess what? That community that has those issues in Uniontown, they are unincorporated. Per capita income in Uniontown is less than $12,000 per year. You go to Flint, right? And I think someone said, I think Chrissy said this. And I'm gonna slow down a little bit. And make sure I stop, because I can go. I have so much to say, so I'm gonna cut me off at 5 minutes, okay? So if I'm going too long, okay? Just raise your hand, like Jacoby, slow down. It's time to move on. But the whole issue with environmental justice, right? One of the previous panelists gave the definition. That definition, as you noted, does not take into account racism, does not take into account historical racism or contemporary racism. I like to say there would be no environmental injustice. It gets back to Chris's presentation. If every environmental rule and regulation was equally protected everyone. If the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act equally protected everyone, lead and copper rule, had it been enforced, we wouldn't have had the Flint water crisis. But the problem is, going back to the first speaker's presentation, and also the speaker talked about Native American issues, the Safe Drinking Water Act does what? It doesn't apply to folks on wells. That's a structural problem. That's structural racism, y'all. So of course you're setting folks up to fail. In the Archer example that I mentioned, in the Mebane example I mentioned, look at folks who live in their industrial CAFOs, right? Confined agricultural feed operations. Most of those folks are on what? Well water. They've been exposed to nitrates. They've been exposed to bacteria. They've been exposed to MRSA as well. Plus, many of our agricultural workers, our immigrant brothers and sisters who are agricultural workers, they're working in camps. Guess what they don't have access to? Potable water. Some of the same people that have family members working in the meat processing plants. Guess what they don't have access to? Water. Water, water, water. We have built-in inequities in our system. So we talked about COVID-19. COVID-19 has made visible the people our policies have made invisible. Folks in colonials, folks dealing without water and reservations, folks in rural areas who don't have basic amenities, people, agricultural workers. So I just want to say that our laws are not equally protecting folks. That's why we're having this conversation. And the laws need to be changed. I think Dr. Tate made some comments that were really, really important about investments. One of the things that Dr. Bullock says is when it comes to disasters and recovery and preparedness, what did he say? Money follows power, money follows power, money follows color, and money follows money. So I may not have said that right, but basically saying is more privileged, wealthy communities get recovery faster, they get access to more resources. That means we have racism, isms, structural inequalities baked into recovery. It's baked into preparedness. And then I want to close out talking about science. And thank you again, Isha, Dr. Ray, when you talked about the science issue. We fundamentally have a broken scientific system in this country. I'm gonna say that. I can go to my own 10 promotion hill. Half of what I did from as relates to research, my community-based work in University of Maryland, CPPR work was not counted in my 10 promotion process. That's a fact. We can talk about the culture of science and how we disincentivize certain types of work and incentivize other types of work. Boyer talks about the 5 dimensions of science: the science of inquiry, the science of teaching, the science of integration, the science of engagement, and the science of application. We over-commodify, over-incentivize inquiry. Discovery science. To me, discovery science is the bane of why we've had an erosion of trust in science in this country. When you talk about science, we have to talk about science as a little s in science when we do science. Science is everyday, science is proximal, science is pocketbook. Why engage communities? I talk about science from a perspective of food, faith, family, health, and jobs. Make science, we're doing science now. We're using science now. We're wearing science, we're eating science, we're breathing science. Some of that's bad science, pollution, right? But my point is, we have to bring science to the people. And we've lost that in the way we've incentivized science. So we over-commodify inquiry science, right? We don't value enough teaching science. We don't value enough integration. That's transdisciplinary science. We need to value that. Engagement science is hard to do. We talk about hard sciences versus soft sciences, right? Soft sciences, working with people. Think about relationships, y'all, in your family. How hard is it even, the good relationships, right? What are the good features of good relationships? You gotta have trust, you gotta have openness, communication, you gotta have some Aretha Franklin, you have to respect. You gotta have the same thing with partnerships. And working with communities is hard. We need to value that more. And then application, as Dr. Ray said, we have all this data. We don't need more data. We need more moral authority to act. And scientists have a tendency of hiding behind being objective. There's no objective science. Say you grew up near a butterfly farm and you do butterfly research. That's the objective. It's time to shut down. Give me like 30 more seconds, right? Butterfly research. That's a positive bias. That's not a bad thing. There's no such thing as objective science. It's about rigor. But in the end, if you're not addressing the problem, it's guinea pig science, it's extractive science, and my community partners call it pain pimping science. So if you're not actually translating that science to action, and it's only benefiting you, you are pimping people's pain. And we need to really change the whole culture of science. And I'm gonna end with this. We need to take a taxpayer's approach to science. If I'm funding you as a taxpayer, what are you doing to address this problem? Where's my return on investment? Where are my social, environmental, economic, and health benefits? If we change the science that we do and that to that framework, to that approach, you will see more actions and benefits to communities. But right now, because of how it's all about us, they are not getting those benefits. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all 3 presenters. I want to thank you for taking time and for visiting us with your reminder that I'm sure you are being asked a lot these days. I'm kind of happy for that. So I'm glad that you're being asked a lot, but we do all appreciate that you took time for us today, and that's to all of our presenters as well. So what I'd love to do now, we heard a lot of great passion, which is exactly what we were hoping to hear, and ideas, and sort of get into the weeds. So thank you also for that. What I'd like to do is have all 3 of our panelists, as well as our presenters this morning, unmute and open up the conversation. And maybe I'll start with asking Radhika and Isha, given the conversation, Radhika had 2 people after her and Isha 1. Any follow-on thoughts? And then we'll broaden and include comments and thoughts from this morning's panelists, presenters as well. Radhika, thoughts? Anything you'd like to add?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to take a moment to, as somebody who is working in communities across America who are trying to implement equity, environmental justice strategies, I'd like to offer, I think, some thoughts on how the Science Board could be a powerful kind of ally to those efforts. So one, I think that there is, Isha, I was like high-fiving when you talked about how much data do we need to know that that race is a problem, all of the injustices we're seeing in communities is a problem. But what I will say is that I also think that there is a need to build the evidence base that local communities need to change the politics, to support their equity and organizing advocacy efforts. So for example, one of the communities that we've been working with is in Camden. And, you know, because of the combined sewers in Camden, when it, and the aging infrastructure, when it rains, children are literally walking through wastewater to get to school when we weren't sheltering in place, right? And one of the things that the equity team that we've been working with in Camden is really looking to do is how do we actually quantify the public health impacts of urban flooding as a way to make another argument for the types of investments that we need. And they, as community organizers, as utility managers, don't have the knowledge base to be able to do that, right? So academics, research centers such as yourselves really could be partners in helping advocates build the evidence base that they need. I think the second thing is frameworks, right? Frameworks do matter, and that having the sort of weight of the academies and the science board putting forward stronger environmental justice frameworks, equity frameworks that are about bolstering the work on the ground, the work of frontline community organizations, the way that Isha and others have been doing. I think that there's so much need for that because frankly, people listen to you all differently than the way they listen to me as a national advocate, and certainly differently than the way that they listen to local frontline organizations. And so the extent to which you use your power and your reach to lift up the voices of frontline communities, I think is just another thing that you all would just be so helpful on. I also think that, you know, one of the things at this moment, both around the Flint water crisis, other calls for the human right to water, now with COVID and the very clear racialized impacts of COVID, not only in water, but across every sector. You know, there is a strong and growing community of practice of advocates who are working together, trying to shape the politics. If we had a community of practice of scholars such as yourselves walking alongside us on these issues, that would be incredibly powerful. So, you know, I do hope that this is not just one meeting, one conversation, but that you really are thinking about how you use the power of the academies on these issues moving forward, because frankly, we need that. I have one other thing. Please, please, please do not create an equity program or an environmental justice line of study through the science board or the academies. I'm not sure all how you're structured. You need to bake this in to every study that you commission or every research product that you fund. As Sakobi said, structural racism is baked into every, I think you said it better than I did, is baked into everything. And so you all really have an opportunity to bake equity and justice considerations into all of the work that you do. Don't just make it a side program.
Thank you, very helpful. Isha, I was going to give you a chance as well. Would you like to jump in?
Thank you. I'll just address one of the points that I raised, and then Radhika also brought up, and there are a couple of chat questions. The point about data. I don't want to be here as an academic arguing that we don't need evidence and we don't need data. I cannot do that. I would never do that. I just want to say that data itself is not an objective or neutral thing, that there is some clear point at which we have enough evidence and we have enough data. That's a judgment call. That also is a judgment call. At some point, what is that point? That's the question. But there's so much we don't know about climate change, but we're freaked out about it, right? Why? There's a reason. There's a lot we don't know yet about, you know, every shit-filled drain in every community. Yeah, we don't have every bit of data for everything we need. I understand that, and I always think it's a good thing to have more because we value what we can measure, as someone has written so beautifully in the chat, and as Radhika said, communities also need good evidence to press forward their case. I'm with everybody on that matter. Nevertheless, I would say that there is a tendency in academia to valorize more data, more technology, and more knowledge above action because we're afraid of being seen as not neutral parties. So somehow only when the data are perfect, beyond reasonable doubt, are we willing to stick our necks out. And what I want to argue is the time has come to move beyond that and to have an honest conversation about, do we have good enough data now to understand how regulations, policies, and equal protection have to be changed? Or do we need more data before we can say this? And I am arguing, no, the time has come. That's all.
Thank you, Isha. What I'd like to do now is
No, Shakobi, did I talk too long?
Go for it.
I'll be brief. Thank you for the other extra time. I'll be brief. I think a couple quick points. I didn't mention I'm on the board of environmental studies and toxicology. We just had a JEDI discussion last week. And so I think one of the points was already made. Environmental justice and equity needs to be integrated into all programs. It cannot be like the Office of Environmental Justice, the EPA, right? You've seen probably some articles that, hey, the EPA hasn't really done a lot on environmental justice because they put most of it in one office. It needs to be integrated throughout all the programs. One of the things I've also said, there's erosion of trust in this country, right, when it comes to science. How do you rebuild it? Those who have the trust, who have the brand recognition, you need to play a bigger role in uplifting science. And so how can you push other science partners? How can you help CDC become that shiny, whatever ornament on the hill again? Because I don't want to say too much more about CDC. CDC, right? How can you make NIH and the funders fund more of this work? It's a huge problem, the fact that we don't have, I wrote a blog, and maybe I'll put it on here, on Medium, and it's very provocative. The blog is entitled Scientific Racism, Scientific Colonialism, and Scientific Imperialism. One of the points that we made in that blog is, in 2015, when it comes to federal funding, historically Black colleges, who should be a primary partner, minority serving institutions, even I don't like the word minority, institutions that with underrepresented groups of color, that really train them, HBCUs in 2015 received less than 3% of federal funding. Right? So if you extend that to age-specific Islander serving institutions, Latinx serving institutions, indigenous colleges, the folks who are on the front line and fence line being impacted by the issues are going to schools that can learn skills that can go back and address the problem. I grew up near a landfill, near a sewage treatment plant, near a concrete plant, near a major highway. My dad's a pipe fitter. My dad has built a lot of these pollution intensive facilities, right? That's the reason why it's not by, I don't have a choice. It's my context. So we need to support more science where people who come from these contexts can actually get skills to actually do something about these issues. But we need to, as an academy, changing how science is done, changing helping to change who's doing the science, and changing how that science is being used for real action. Whether it be evaluation science, when regulatory, science evaluation, investing more in that, or also science that speaks to interventions, public health interventions, and also science, did you clean the air? Did you improve access to water? Did you improve access to housing? Did you improve access to safe food? Did you reduce the hazards? Did you reduce disparities? Did you empower folks? I mean, these are kind of things that science should be.
I think we lost the Kobe. Great, thank you. What I'd like to do is welcome our presenters from this earlier session back in and hear reactions or comments from them. We do have several board members who have questions, but I'm going to hold them off because we get to hear from them regularly. I want to be sure we have an opportunity first to hear from our guests. So Stephen, Eric, Daryl, Christy, Yolanda, if you have thoughts, reactions, please unmute, and I'll try to be quiet for a while and allow you to have some interchange, and then we'll move on to board questions later.
Well, I'll just start by saying I think this has been a wonderful discussion to date. I really love the emphasis on putting consideration of justice into everything, right? When we are thinking about how do we do water delivery, we have to think about it think first about who doesn't have it, right? And who is it who's not getting served, and how do we correct that problem? And who is living in a place where the systems, they may have been good, but they're deteriorating. But then the second question is why, and the why will get us to that integration, right? Because I have a colleague, Jennifer Carrera, who did her dissertation on lack of access to water issues, comparing Detroit and Lowndes County, Alabama. She came out of her dissertation talking about water bundles, because really, as Yolanda articulated really nicely, and in a lot of ways, Eric Tate's research articulates very nicely, the issue when people are living with these issues, they're not just dealing with the fact that they don't have water. It's a full range of don't haves because of the structural conditions in which they live. And really that does, I mean, what everyone has said over and over again, that boils down to usually some form of structural racism, right? And so, this becomes, in some ways, this becomes a medium to look at social power and addressing social power imbalances. I noted that Dr. Wilson just put Catherine Coleman Flowers' name in the chat. We are at a moment when we can make some change, and we see that in things like the MacArthur Genius Fellowship Award going to someone like Catherine Flowers, who's been working for the last 2 decades trying to deal with water issues, with sanitation issues in Lowndes County, Alabama. So I'm really hopeful that we're on a springboard, and maybe we can move to getting to some of that justice that we hope.
All right, so I appreciate Isha and Sokobe's comments. I too am exhausted by this. So in my work, the stuff I presented earlier, no surprise, the biggest indicators of disparity in terms of flood exposure were housing and race, right? But we like to talk about these. First of all, I think there's an emphasis on just like documenting disparities and then stopping. Second of all, treating like these are independent factors. I mean, what I really appreciate about environmental justice is that it compels people to not only document these disparities, but look at why. What are the processes? A lot of times, so much of it is tied up in history. So, we find that there's the disparity in housing, but, this has to do with histories of racial covenants and blockbusting, the GI Bill, lending exclusion, zoning, urban renewal. All of these are taking place. And so we look at this housing variable and we think it's a housing problem. What it's not, it's a racism problem. Okay. And until we, as a society, we can't even acknowledge that this is an issue, really. I mean, and we don't do it at our universities. And so I'm actually highly skeptical. I wish I could be optimistic, but I'm continually frustrated. And so I understand Isha's comment about data. Like at some point, we don't want to be using this excuse to gather more data as for inaction. But I think data is actually useful at attacking some of the common measures that we're using to make decisions. Okay. The other point is, in addition to examining who's affected, I think we can look at the other end of the spectrum and say, instead of not just who's not being served, but who is being served. Not just who's not receiving resources, but who is receiving resources, to understand what processes are associated with that, to understand sort of race and racism from another angle.
Yeah, if I could jump on after Eric, I just agree with everything I agree, not saying I disagree, I say I just agree with so much that's been said. And, one of the things that I read an article this morning, I think it was in the New York Times, it was talking about COVID vaccinations in Pittsburgh. And, the Black community there not wanting to receive the vaccine for so many, relevant reasons, not wanting to be experimented upon, and the history of the ways in which scientists and science have treated the Black community left people distrustful of this, of being vaccinated. And one of the things that I think that article said to me was that, and there was a quote in there that one of the community members said, I believe in the science, but not the scientists. Right. And when I read that, it hurt me, to say, but no, I'm a scientist too. I want to care, I care about you. I'm giving everything I can humanly possible to help. But I think that what that says to me is that universities and scientists and all of this expertise have failed. We are part of the problem. We need to investigate and see the ways in which we're contributing to and perpetuating the inequities that exist within society and within various communities. And so how do we look at ourselves not as, oh, it's the current administration that's, causing these issues. It's, if we just had enough data, it's, or a lack of data, it's really also part of the role of the academy to serve, the population. And especially in public universities, right, where we should be agents of change in those communities, we're not. And so really, how do we change the ways in which we view ourselves, reward, again, like what our true, change should be, and the ways in which we should be acting, the ways we should be contributing against, the colonial, again, white supremacist culture that exists and permeates within, the academic institutions as well. So I just think that we need to be using this mirror to look at ourselves as well and understand the ways in which we contribute and the ways in which we can change our own culture in order to impact those who we most want to impact and help.
Just to add to what everyone has said, and thank you all so very much. It's been a wonderful, and I think we all could say it is tiring, because these issues have been going on for centuries. Let's be real, and they're intentional. This isn't by accident. I think of, if we look at redlining, segregation, contract for deed, reservations, and so forth. Dr. Bullard shared with me, look above ground, look below ground. What do you expect? And I think this is about looking below ground, below the ground. What do we expect? And I think that really resonated with me when he said that, because it's so true. And sometimes when things are so obvious, to build upon what you said, Isha, it's uncomfortable. But I also believe that the need for data is to continue to demonstrate that this just isn't someone having a conversation. It's consistent. And then one of the questions about correlations, one of the biggest challenges with what I find with drinking water, especially when I'm speaking to the press and they want a quick soundbite and they realize they're not going to get one for me, because it's not causal. I can't tell you this is causal. I'd love to sit there and say, oh, it's just one thing. So I think it's how we communicate our science and how we connect the dots and pull the thread, and we can whatever terms we want to use. But fundamentally, we know that if someone's drinking contaminated water, it's not good for their health. It could potentially not be good for pregnant women in utero, for people with diabetes, sensitive populations. So where I would say, what I would add that, to this discussion is that in terms of data, where I believe we need to have more of it is what happens to the population. Work with our clinicians, work with what are the adverse effects that people have to deal with beyond the examples that I shared, but people who have regulated water, to Christy's point, these communities that had ongoing violations or not monitoring and reporting. What are the health outcomes that we're seeing? Are we potentially seeing higher prevalence of diabetes or renal failure, like we've seen in the literature in Bangladesh that we've experienced with arsenic levels? And what's really going on in our water? What is it really doing to us as a society? And I don't think we really can answer those questions. So I would say that's an area where there needs to be an investment. And then lastly, I think partnering with communities is a part of it, but we also have to partner with our regulatory agencies, with our departments of health, and with the water sector, because the water sector, just as hungry as we are. I mean, I feel so blessed and fortunate in Tennessee to work with public water operators, and we try to break down the TMF challenges to make them about community-based, and how do we convince residents in a community that what they're paying for and the value of water, and the disinvestment and how we need to invest and so forth. And all of these are extremely complex. I think it goes back to, again, that we need many voices, many ideas, many approaches, and that this does have, it's called a community water system for a reason. The communities, I believe that if they had a deeper understanding, that they would be involved. And for those communities that don't have one, and I keep going back to hearing Scobie's words and just say, what is it going to take for us to do something? What's it really going to take? That's it.
I guess I'm last. Thank you so much, for your comments, last few presenters. And, I just wanted to add, thank you for having this conversation, because it absolutely gives me an ability to talk about the broader issue, which is the continued genocide and extermination and assimilation of the indigenous people of this country, and the continued perpetuation of the delusion of our past that absolutely pervades every aspect of our life. And I think every aspect of this country, because we hold on to that lie, and it is a lie. And so, and it goes further than that, because we live with this every single day, like you said, and it gets tiring. But I can't help but be inspired by the 10 Tribes Partnership of the Colorado Rivers vision statement that talks about a spiritual mandate, to lead by a spiritual mandate to protect the Colorado River. And, those kind of things, even in spite of everything that goes on, the spirit that gets injected into because of the ownership and our place of being, is pervasive. And we've been here for thousands of years, and we will continue to be here thousands of years. And one of the things that highlights are things like, yes, we're given rights to water in the Colorado River Basin, as I said earlier, up to 25% of the volume. But right now, or before last year, before the drought contingency plan was implemented, there was 1.5 million acre feet estimated of unused tribal entitlement in the basin. So here you go, we get a right. And then you make it almost impossible for us to be able to use any of that right. And so here we go again. You have Cocopah, and for those of you who don't know, the Colorado River does not flow to the Sea of Cortez anymore. It stops at the U.S.-Mexico border. So when you have a group of people like Cocopah or the Chemehuevi whose life is given and whose life is based on the river, and there is no more river there, that's genocide. And, I can't call it anything other than that. And that exists in today, right now. And so thank you, all of you, for allowing me to have the platform to really call it as it is. Thank you.
So we were supposed to go to questions from the broader audience and our board members, but honestly, I would prefer to continue to hear from the group of people here. If there are other things you'd like to share, any of you, I don't feel the need to go in order. If you don't feel like, but I just think this is really remarkable, and I really would love to hear more.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. I'll try to be succinct. I really appreciate these discussions, because you're hearing people's spirit, and this is, and like one of my colleagues, Mustafa Ali, likes to say, real talk. I like when we have real talk. Yes, the data is important, and I don't want to let anybody think I do a lot of data collection, y'all. I do a lot of build hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks, because we need to get better data, as Dr. Tate said, to document the problem, to document what the community already knows. The community members, as Dr. Mitchell McLean, Harambe House, Savannah, they're dealing with water quality issues down there, daytime flooding, sea level rise, all sorts of goods moving the community. It's just they're the subject matter experts. So folks who live in the front line and fence line, they are the subject matter experts. So we need to uplift their community and cultural knowledge systems. We have to bring more of that into science. And I think without that, I think we're going to continue to deal with the erosion of science and see science in many ways not seen as value. But yes, Dr. Tate, documentation is really, really important. And so we're developing a lot of tools. So I'm not doing the science. This is where the citizen science, community science comes in. We're developing a lot of tools so we get the tools into the hands of the people. How to democratize science, right? So we're building apps, we're building sensors, we're building geospatial tools so folks can use them themselves to document what they're going through. I think we should really emphasize that, how we can decentralize science. And not science is not up here, but science is more grassroots, okay? So I just want to say that real quick. So thank you. So I can hear myself want to say more, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
And just to add to that, I think is what is knowledge? Who produces knowledge? So I think that's really important as well as we talk about data. We actually do have lots and lots of data. We just look at it. And the second piece, someone mentioned this earlier about the Safe Drinking Water Act, this illusion that we're under that it's safe. I think that also is something that from a policy standpoint, because I'm so close to this, the other day, like, oh, they're not going to regulate PFAS, they're not going to do this, and it's outrageous, I'm going crazy, and like, and how can this be? And I think we really should care. The number of how we are continuing to live in a world where the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water are two separate and they're not connected. Why aren't they connected? Why don't we have regulatory and public health departments working together in the same divisions? That I think it's about asking why decisions are being made that are not in the best interest of the citizens. And it's our country. So what are we going to do about this? And when it shouldn't take 20 years or never for a contaminant that we know is harmful to be regulated. So, we go back to the ATSDR. I mean, when you spend time looking at those toxicology reports and trying to understand, we can't go testing on humans, but we do have, there's another case. There's enough data for you to say, probably not good. So I think there needs to be more transparency in what's currently available, and also more discussions about how do we can't get 80,000 plus chemicals monitored, but I also don't think the current list, whether it's 88 or 91, that is also not sufficient for how chemicals are used in the manufacturing processes in this country. I think there needs to be more done on that.
Go ahead, Isha, please jump in.
Thank you. I want to just share some thoughts on democratizing the science or being more accountable to communities that we work with, and to some extent respond to an excellent question in the chat, like what are some ways in which you can bake in equity into everything and not have like a separate equity office, or he works on science and he works on equity, right? How can we prevent that sort of weird binary, which is not helpful at all? So I'm thinking that one way we could think about this as scientists and educators is to be rigorous and true to the methods and the analysis and the honesty and transparency of our work, without which we are nothing, but to actually have the questions that we seek to address be guided by what communities think of as their needs, their barriers, and their challenges. So there's a tradition in our work of drawing on the literature. Like, what is the gap in the literature that your PhD seeks to fill? And that's an important question. I don't want to denigrate it in any way. But when the literature isn't rising to the level of the social problem, then perhaps we should be looking to the communities as our guides as to what the questions are that they need addressed in order to provide the kind of evidence that they need for their advocacy. After that, we are definitely not obligated. In fact, we are obligated not to produce palatable results. That is unacceptable. But to be guided by what the community's needs are in what we decide to look at as a science question of social interest, that is our obligation, much more than we have taken it to be an obligation in the past, where we have gone much more on, how can we add new knowledge from the state of the current literature. Maybe we should more readily ask, how can we add new knowledge and new evidence from what communities need to answer? So that's just a suggestion of how we can bake things in.
Isha, that is such an excellent point. And with the risk of sounding naive, because I will say, I am sort of the one non-academic on the panel or the non-scientist on the panel. And I'm just learning about how the science board is structured, but even just as the board members were introducing themselves, what if you had board members that were from frontline communities who are the ones most impacted by water challenges, or, instead of listening to the academics who are doing great research in this space, or even me running a national organization working on these issues, like what if you all had a session with the water justice advocates who are on the ground in these communities doing this work? I mean, to me, those are some of the other things that the science board, might want to consider. So just some additional thoughts.
Yeah, and I agree with that 100%. I think that the National Academies of Sciences has a role in playing, in determining what we mean by science and what we mean by data, what we mean by understanding. And so, going to a lot of these meetings, you'll see one or two community members, but there isn't real true representation and discussion about the actual problems that people are facing. And so I think that to the extent that the Academy and this board can think about the ways in which it's framing questions, the people that are invited to give talks, the people that are sitting in the conversations, not just tweeting it out to find a broader audience, but actually including folks in the conversation would be amazing. So I just wanted to second that thought.
Well, and Christy, just what you said sparked a related thought, which is, what if the science board had a listening session where you were in listening mode, where you asked water justice advocates, frontline communities, what can we do to support you and the agenda you're trying to move? How do we take the brand, the name, the reach of the academies, of all of these amazing scholars that we've amassed to support you, right? Wouldn't that flip the switch essentially in how kind of we approach research and data to say, how does this serve you? It's a complete repositioning, right, around things that would, I think, be extremely welcome in the communities that are hardest hit by these challenges.
Hey, this should come again. Just in case you didn't see it, I put some stuff in the chat. I think NEJAC would be a great resource as a federal factor. We have a number of indigenous reps dealing with water issues on NEJAC from around the country. Also, folks dealing with agricultural workers and other issues. Sylvia Ordonez, she's in Michigan. She's all on top of PFAS. She would be great to engage. There's an interagency working group on environmental justice. There'll be another entity that's integrated within the federal family to engage. We recently had a National Wildlife Federation recently had a set of roundtable discussions on EJ and COVID-19. A lot of issues around water came up, but it was a young lady, Monica Lewis from Detroit. We the People. Guy talked to We the People Detroit.
Yep.
She blew
Monica Lewis Patrick.
She blew me. I started getting up starting to march after she talked for about 5 minutes. We the People Detroit. Gotta talk to them. And then also the folks, the Flint water crisis. There's different perspectives on what happened in Flint. And there's some voices I don't think have been really heard clearly. So I think going back to folks in Flint, and then I mentioned Sand Branch earlier. You got folks across the country who have been engaged and who are having discussed these conversations. So trying to meet the folks where they are and taking the board to those folks. Dr. Bullard and his group has the HBCU CBO Climate Equity Consortium, Gulf Coast, New Orleans, Houston, Biloxi, Africatown. Y'all know about Africatown, the Clotilda, the last ship of enslaved Africans in Pensacola, Florida. All of them dealing with water issues. So there's some potential partners that are out there, outside there.
Yeah, all this time I spend, on proposal review panels, gets me thinking about like what kinds of research and work is supported and funded. And wherever panel you go to, there's a set of criteria that are employed, right, for saying what's the best science. What does it contribute? I think we also need to maybe take a step back and think about like, what's the moral responsibility of science? How can we embed that, what we come up from that into evaluation criteria of what we support and prioritize? To what extent are questions actually reflecting, this is what's been said earlier, community priorities, and honoring that and respecting that knowledge, putting that on par or even higher than other types of data and information that we use in scientific analysis. And I think that, if we evaluate what we support in different ways, we could end up with a lot more creative and collaborative findings that can be meaningful.
Just a quick add-on. I use this term taxpayer science. That's part of a book I'm writing. So I don't want y'all to use that term without attribution. The book is not done yet. Just letting y'all know now. I was supposed to be on sabbatical this past spring. The worst sabbatical ever, right? Worst sabbatical ever. But the book is called How the Game is Rigged, How Science is Rigged. First part is about how science is rigged. The second section is about how to hack the game. And the third section is about how to reinvent the science of the game. And part of the third section is on taxpayer science. So I just want to make sure I share that with y'all before you were used to it. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I also really like the idea of just building trust. Like how do we know or understand that our role as scientists are to support communities and build trust within these communities? How do we also, in any type of, again, tenure decision, funding decision, make sure that there are explicit questions about who did this impact and why, so we start to bake that in. I think also as you're thinking about the ways in which to engage with communities, shifting the ways in which we engage. So you don't have a meeting in the middle of the day, for 4 or 5 hours that people have to, that if people are working and people don't have childcare, especially right now, that they can't log into. So how do you also think about the structures in which you are engaging? So it isn't simply just bringing people to put on a show, so to speak, but to actually, again, meet them where they are. So, just to make those considerations known as well.
I'm gonna say one more thing real quick. Dr. Tate, right on point about funding. Y'all saw, so the blog I just put in about the scientific racism, there was a section that we highlight some recent NIH studies about the lack of R1s, the differential rate of R1s for Black faculty compared to white faculty, or people of color faculty compared to white faculty. Crazy numbers, right? So how are we going to really change how we fund research? And it gets back to the point about how racism is baked in to the peer review process, baked into, as others have already said, what questions count. And that's highly problematic when we're doing, and NIH's missions a biomedical mission, right? So it's a mission just to study the problem, just to be honest, in my opinion. It's reductionist. We're talking about science that is more holistic, that's more solutions oriented. We have to change the way NIH funds stuff, also NSF, all the federal funders, and then also even the foundations, getting them more into this space as well, because they have a lot of dollars that can be leveraged. So going back to Dr. Tate's comment, you're exactly right. Research dollars should be seen as investments. Community development block grant dollars are already investments. Any infrastructure dollars, working with environmental finance centers, stormwater runoff, stormwater BMPs, right? Capital works Capital works in cities, you're talking about problematic, the sewage backup issues in Baltimore and across the country. Capital works, we have to change the culture of those entities because the engineers, I just engineer. I don't worry about the context. But going back to Dr. Tate's point real quick, we have to look at all these monies as investments in communities. So thank you, Dr. Day, for that comment about the funding.
And this also makes me think about, as we do invest dollars in communities, we put in a public water system, that a part of that should be, well, what are the improvements to the members of the community? How much more money do they have to invest in X? How much more time did they do that? Like, again, partnering with these organizations, that how do we find those partnerships and say, okay, this is going on in our community, and how do we become a part of that? And then how do we find the appropriate funding mechanisms to allow that type of research to be done? Beyond, I'm just taking on another thing because I really believe in this and I want to do it.
If I could add real quickly, just for board and a perspective on policy and science, in the Colorado River Basin, the 07 guidelines were structured around a real narrow NEPA process that really was only inclusive of the conversation with the 7 basin states and reclamation. And since then, there's been a supply-demand study. There's been talk about structural deficit and this imbalance, and the system can't be sustained based on the science. But what we're seeing is that, this current structure of policymaking, there's no inclusion or no process, no structures for inclusion of science into the current policymaking. And so, we're talking about, millions and millions of acre feet and millions of people impacted, but, the basic, operational guidelines of the Colorado River, which is the policy, is not inclusive of a science component. And it's left to each basin state or the reclamation to maybe to make a decision to be inclusive of that conversation. So we have some of the best science, Brad Udall is a friend of mine, Jack Schmidt at Utah State, incredible science. And their conversation is all about being inclusive into this policy-making process, in those black area that we saw earlier. And there's an extreme resistance to maintaining the status quo, which ultimately, is not sustainable in the Colorado River Basin. So when we start to look at, how do we include science in this conversation? And, part of that conversation is how does that get acknowledged and at the state level, at the federal level as well? And so building that within the 7 basin states in terms of just acceptance of the basic science around the Colorado River Basin is something that, definitely that we're committed to doing and that needs to happen, because it doesn't really exist in terms of the coordination of, the science at the state level, at a regional level, at a tribal level, and at a federal level. And because of Mexico's inclusion in this conversation at an international level. And so, the science has indicated that this system is near failure, near collapse, but, that disconnect with the broader political world and policy world, is going to cause, if we don't do something real quickly within the framework of time that we have within the next 5 years to actually build these connections and hopefully build these connections and networks of networks that will hopefully move, how the Colorado River Basin really is managed, and that it needs to be inclusive of all the voices that it needs to be inclusive of.
I think the point that Daryl makes is really important across all of our cases, which is that there are vested interests who benefit from the current system and the current ways of doing. And so yes, we have long had this myth that science is not political. It is, right? And there are power structures who benefit from the old ways of doing things that were not inclusive. And those power structures will act as power structures powerful people do, and they will resist in small ways and big ways. And we see that within our academic institutions. on a regular basis. But we also see that within society, of course, because they're benefiting, right? And so they don't want that benefit to change. And so, so I do think there's a necessity to recognize that this is going to take some addressing very real power structures, power imbalances, and powerful actors.
I'm pausing because I want to be sure that I'm not interrupting. I'm afraid that our time is about up. So I will go ahead, I guess, and close. And I just want to thank you all so much for your presentations, what you shared with us, and most especially your passion and transparent discussion. It's been very, very enriching to me personally, and I hope to many members of the board. We genuinely would welcome more suggestions. The ideas that you shared in the last 20 minutes were exactly the kinds of things we were hoping to begin to tee up, and they're really, really valuable. So please reach out, send an email, anything you can do. And I again want to say that I'm sorry that this is so exhausting for you and for much of the country, but I am very, very happy that people are bothering you about these things now, even though you may not be. That don't know how else we can make progress without hearing from people who have so much to say. So thank you for sharing. I do want to remind everybody that there will be a recording available. So if there's others that you would like to share this with, please feel free. It's on the Earth YouTube channel of the Academy. So please do that. And again, thank you very, very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everybody.